You're listening to Opera Box Score.
Let's get ready to rumble!
Wherever you are, however you're listening, it's America's talk radio show about opera. It's Opera Box Score. I'm Weston Williams, joined by, via the magic of podcasting archives, Oliver Camacho and Matt Cummings. All right, this week, our regular recording day is Monday, and that is Memorial Day, so the team is taking a patriotic timeout, and we bring you two Inside the Huddle features with great American artists, Ricky Ian Gordon and Sylvia McNair. Both my co-hosts in the 2-minute drill will return next week if I can pull Oliver away from the French Open for 3 minutes. Make sure you subscribe to our podcast on Spotify. Click follow on Apple Podcasts. Hit the plus sign. Email us your hot takes by writing to mailbag@operaboxscore.com or email us a voice memo using the You Got Something to Say tab on our website, operaboxscore.com. However you contribute, you'll get an OBS beer coaster, an OBS lapel pin, and a #1 OBS fan foam finger just for sharing your own hot take. Now, folks, it's just you and me in a room with this microphone. I'm staring down at it, wondering what I could possibly talk about. And, usually when I'm in this position, I'm like, who will have something to say? Oliver Camacho. But unfortunately, the thing he has to say things about is always tennis, so it's no great loss. Let's talk some opera.
Huddle up. Let's go Inside the Huddle.
Ricky Ian Gordon's new opera, This House, with a libretto by Lynn Nottage and Ruby Ayo Gerber, will receive its world premiere this Saturday at Opera Theater of St. Louis. For those of you intending to attend the festival and be welcomed into the green and white tents, we thought we would reshare our Inside the Huddle segment from last fall on the publication of Ricky Ian Gordon's autobiographical memoir, Seeing Through, a chronicle of sex, drugs, and opera.
Will there really be a morning? Is there such a thing as death?
Will There Really Be a Morning? A song by Ricky Ian Gordon. We heard the new recording featuring Nadine Sierra. And our guest today is Ricky Ian Gordon. Welcome to Opera Box Score.
Thank you for having me.
So Weston and I have experienced your book, the title of which is Seeing Through Sex, Drugs, and Opera.
Seeing Through, a chronicle of sex, drugs, and opera.
Okay. So I think clearly that's going to be the episode title. It's going to be Sex, Drugs, and Opera featuring Ricky Ian Gordon. And, for me, reading this book, I wasn't shocked about anything. What I was shocked about was that you would let other people read this book besides people like me. It's like this book was written for me. But I'm thinking about Weston. Weston and I are friends, but we don't know about each other's personal lives that much. Weston, are you like Catholic or some kind of Christian or something like that?
I some flavor if you go back in there for sure. Yeah. It was certainly, the experience of reading it is not something I could recommend to every single person I know, but it was a deeply, deeply moving book. And actually, as a matter of fact, when I was reading it, there were a number of times, Oliver, when I was like, because initially I was just going to be the only one who read it and reported back. And there was a certain point where I'm like, Oliver needs to read this book specifically.
Yeah. Well, just so the audience knows what we're talking about, you don't waste any time
no.
at the start of the book in just telling people things that are extremely personal. And I feel like it's almost like, okay, well, if you can get past this chapter, then you can read the rest of this book. What did your editor say or did your editor actually give you the idea to organize it that way?
So my editor was Jonathan Galassi, and he's a great editor, and he bought the book those were the chapters I sent him right from the beginning. And I had no intention of publishing this book. One of the questions you said you were going to ask me is, how did I decide to be so candid at the top of the book? But the whole point of, I had started a writing group during the pandemic, and I was in quarantine, just like everybody else. And the writing group I started was full of writers I deeply admire. And I wanted to impress them, but I knew I'm not going to impress them as a stylist with the beauty of each of my sentences. What I have to give them is my truth. What is true for me? And it was a way of being intimate with them, like saying, this is who I am. And so as I started writing, it was very cathartic for me. And I would read it to them and they would be shocked at its candor. And so one day, one of the writers, Nick Flynn, was talking about that there was a kind of energy in the writing. And truly on a lark, I just sent some of what I was writing to Jonathan Galassi and said, Jonathan, you don't even have to read this, but if you do, I sort of can guarantee you that it might be different from any other composer memoir you would read.
I read some of Ned Rorem's, diaries, but this goes a little bit further.
Yeah, and that's the truth is. So
Yeah.
I think that's what attracted him to it, and he was not shocked. He was supportive. And, to tell you the truth, like you guys, there was a moment when I knew, okay, this book is going to be published. And it was the first time I went back to the Met after, the quarantine, when, you could get in you waited online and you had the evidence of your vaccines and masks. And I remember sitting at the Met that night and seeing Heidi Waleson from the Village Voice walking down the aisle thinking, Heidi Welson's going to know a lot more about me.
Oh, the Wall Street Journal.
Yes. So I was scared then. But as soon as the book came out, and obviously the press was pretty good, and I thought there was a kind of power in it for me because I felt like, well, this is me saying this is who I am. And it truly is who I am. And it's quite detailed, and you either like me or you don't like me. But at least it's not reliant on my notes, which you are often, as I say in the book, revered and reviled for something you do that can be quite abstract. And this book is not abstracted. It's very intimate, and it's the truth. So I thought it somehow oddly made me feel more powerful because I felt like I had more agency.
Well, we're going to talk about opera in just a moment. We have a lot of questions about opera, but I just want the audience to know, especially if you are a gay man of a certain age, let's say your 40s or older, you've heard me say this many times on the podcast, and I'll say it again for new listeners, that our generation didn't have mentors who are your generation, Ricky. And I think we lost more than just mentors, but we also lost a handing down of culture. And I feel like my generation is ignorant of so many things that I'm crazy about. And I wonder, where are my people? We were never taught the things that you have to teach, the things you have to share. And in experiencing your book, I felt like, oh my gosh, this has been missing. This exact frank talk about the body, about desire, about sex, and about art. This is all the stuff that I needed to hear when I was 19, when I was 20, So, yeah, it really means a lot to me. So,
you know what? That's very moving for me to hear because I don't even think I thought of it that way, Oliver. I mean, for me, I was just, obviously, a lot of the things I talked about happened in the dead center of my life, So when you say that to me, it makes me feel a whole other layer of gratitude about having written it, because to feel like I went through something and expressing that is useful to a whole other generation, that's really touching to me. And, just to say, you guys, too, it hasn't only been gay people of a certain age that have responded to the book, which has been, I got a call. There's a guy named Mark Horowitz who he's in charge of all the archives at the Library of Congress. And he's married with, he said, your book is helping me live my life in a different way because I never even imagined someone could be that frank. And I like hearing that because it's like, you know, we live in a culture that is so dishonest in so many ways. You know, it feels like an act of anarchy, to tell the truth.
Well, here's how I'm going to bring it to opera. People who've been listening to the show for the past year know that I had an experience watching Pelléas and Mélisande and meeting for the first time a young baritone named Hugh Montague Rendell. His father's David Rendell, the tenor. His mother's Dinah Montague, the mezzo-soprano. Yeah. And Hugh is an incredible musician. And I like Pelléas. I'm not obsessed with it, but like after hearing him sing Pelléas, I was like, oh my gosh, like it was so touching. And I'm not stalking him. I'm not like sending him a dress or anything like that. But I really have become like a huge fan of his. And I said to him when I met him, it's like, oh, you're going to sing Billy Budd. Like this role was meant for you. And he probably knew that he was, but he couldn't tell me because the contract wasn't officially signed. But he, in fact, is about to sing Billy Budd next month at Vienna State Opera. It's his role debut. And when I think of him singing this role, already I get emotional because he's so beautiful and he's so authentic as an artist. He's so thoughtful. And to think of somebody like him who's so just embodies, you know, the love of music, to think of him dying on stage, it's like, I can't. I can't. So can you talk about Billy Budd while it like...
Well, I'll tell you, by the way, that, you know, I'm close with Nathan Gunn. And it was when I saw Nathan do it at the Met that I was very upset. In a way I had never been upset watching this opera. Because, you know, just to say about Nathan, a lot of people like all that sort of barahunk stuff. That is so not who Nathan is, like not even remotely. He's a really thoughtful, introspective, intelligent man. And I felt when I watched Billy Budd at the Met, I couldn't make peace anymore with who those people are. I felt like Captain Vere is a coward and evil wins in that opera. Mm. And it made me sick when I watched it. And it truly did. And I even feel like that the opera didn't even know what I was supposed to feel, because Benjamin Britten writing Captain Vere for Peter Pears, right? And that music, it's romantic, it's beautiful, it's reflective, but really, it's horrible that Captain Vere does what he does and lets Claggart get away with destroying a human being in that way. And so I love that opera and I hate that opera. And one of the most powerful moments in that opera is when the men, after Billy Budd dies, and just like, when they're just moaning to the music. It's so incredible. And by the way, it's also obviously very powerful that the music is used in that Beau Travail, the movie Beau Travail, which is the retelling of the Billy Budd story in the, you know, French. It's French army. It's very powerful, and that's how I think, you know. And growing up, I love Billy Budd. I mean, and I think one of the first melodies I loved in my life is da 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 da. You know, that beautiful melody that's on the saxophone. So I have very complicated feelings about it, and frankly, Oliver, I'm happy that I'm going to see your friend do it, because it might be a whole new experience for me, and in Vienna.
This is what is in the book for people who haven't read it yet. You have ideas about operas and you have these like lists and you just like rattle off like pages of ideas about things that you love. And it's really a book. It could be a separate book, just how you talk about opera. I can pull all those parts out of this memoir. But of course, you're also a composer. And Weston and I wanted to ask you about some of your works. Weston,
Well, absolutely. One of the things that's so apparent in not just in the book, but if you listen to any of your compositions, you have this, and even just now, the deep love you have for these singers and the human voice. And you really get the sense whenever you hear something from like, say, Grapes of Wrath, which you talk about in the book as being a great success or premiere with what was it, Minnesota Opera. And just like the care you have for the voice when you compose, and compose something as iconic and that could be really sort of almost, monolithic. This big, great American novel is now becoming an opera, but you make it so human and so personal. What was that process like, specifically with Grapes of Wrath for you?
Well, I'm glad the thing is, Weston, what you said about that could be ... I mean, obviously that was like, could have been the sword of Damocles hanging over my head.
Yes.
What you have to do is you have to personalize those stories, and you have to decide who those people are inside of you. And because I love the voice more than anything in the world, assigning that incredible story and those beautiful characters to a voice in my head that felt right to me. And especially a lot of times I write, at the time, I was very close with Lorraine Hunt Lieberson. And really, I was writing Ma Jode for Lorraine. And she knew, and then she got sick. But it was always for that kind of voice and that kind of heart. So if you listen to the recording and you hear Deanne Meek, that's what Deanne Meek was to me. And she knew it. She was the essential, exquisite lyric mezzo-soprano who had A's, beautiful A's and a B flat, but that earthly color in her voice. There was such a thing and then to decide, for example, that Casey, this sort of deposed preacher who's basically what he aspires to is the highest thing in the opera. So he has the highest voice. He has the tenor voice. It was such a privilege to make music to that story. And that, as I say in the book, I had never read the book. I lied and said I need to reread it. So when I read it, and I just thought, who am I to turn this story into an opera? I mean, this little, Jew from Long Island. But I thought at least then I had enough foresight to know if something like this is thrown into your lap, you have to say, yes, this is fate. And I knew as I was doing it that I was finding that story deep inside of me. I just did, and there were moments like when I wrote the whole Noah scene, and then I wrote the lullaby in about an hour. And I called Kevin, my partner at the office. At the time, he was the deputy editor of Condé Nast Traveler. And I said, you have to hear this. And I sang it to him over the phone. I knew there was something happening where it felt like, ooh, something really big is happening. And I remember the first day in rehearsals when they first brought the truck into the room. And I cried. I just felt like, wow, this is so much bigger than me. Like the Jodes are here and this story is taking flight and it's bigger than me and it's bigger than Michael Corey and bigger than Rosalind Elias. It was so profound. And now I've had that experience many times because that was my first big, big opera. I mean, there was Tibetan Book of the Dead before that, but that was like writing an opera in the intensive care ward. So now I've had that experience many times of feeling like they are here. Gertrude Stein is here. Alice B. Toklas is here. It's very profound feeling to give voice to those characters. And, Weston, one thing you said, I say it, but my mother was a singer. My greatest desire is to give singers something that ennobles them on the stage, and in their bodies and in their voice. And so it's a very big privilege. And luckily, not to say, oh, and I'm good at it, but to say, I think I'm good at it. I love voices. I know what will make them sound great.
I think it's absolutely fair to say you're good at it. I mean, one of the most remarkable things about your style, I think there's a big sort of conflict that often happens in contemporary opera where you have like sometimes really singable stuff, but it is very much imitative of a style that, frankly, in my opinion, has been dead a long time. Or you have something that is hyper modern, trying to go to these heights of intellect and emotion, but no one can sing it. The singability and the idea of ennobling the performer, not just as a character, but as a person, I think is something that really comes through in your music, and the affection for the performers come through in your book as well. I want to talk a little bit about, your chamber opera Ellen West as well, because that's a great example of the book. When I read it, I could tell you had a special affection for this opera, and in some ways, you almost had this almost autobiographical connection to the main character. Can you tell us a little bit about that as well?
When my partner Jeffrey died in 1996, I was a poet friend, Michael Klein, steered me to the work of Frank Bedard. And it was actually one poem in particular, a poem of his called The Yoke, which is a poem he wrote about losing his friend Joe Brainerd. But the poem was so powerful to me, and I started reading the rest of his work, and I found something in his work I had never seen before, which was so many things. One thing was just the way it looked on the page, the way he used capitals, the way he used italics, the way he used white space, But he had these 3 poems. One was called Herbert White, about basically a murderer. One was called Ellen West, and one was called The War of Václav Nijinsky. Ellen West is in really 2 voices. The voice of a doctor and the voice of a patient named Ellen West, who has an eating disorder. Before there were words like anorexia or bulimia, she was based on a real person. It was Dr. Binswanger, who kept a diary about a patient of his, and he called her Ellen West. But he wrote a book. It was a very powerful case study about this woman, Ellen West. And Frank read it, I believe, when he was at Wellesley, and it stayed with him. And eventually he made this poem out of that case study. And when I read it, I have struggled my whole life, not only with eating issues, with issues regarding my body, with issues of expectation. It's a very painful thing for me. I have a series of expectations for myself, and if I don't meet them every day, there is a kind of pain that engulfs me. And I try to be very honest about it in the book. And in Ellen West, what eventually kills this woman is her ideals. Her ideals don't allow her to live in the world where her own fallibility makes it impossible to live. And so I have chosen instead to participate in the vulnerability of that, and to talk about it, and to be in the solution for me, which is honesty. And that's for me the solution to everything. I mean, when I gave up drugs and I gave up alcohol, and in a way, when I stopped, all my sex addictions and obsessions, what was left was these threads of the expectation, the sadness, the grief, and I just started talking about them, and Ellen West embodied them. I mean, and I talk about this, but in the very last thing that happens in that opera, she writes a letter to her friend who's still in the hospital, and the doctor has finally let her go home. And she goes home with her husband, and he sings this thing about, on the 3rd day of being home, she is as if transformed. And she eats to the point where she's finally full. She eats chocolates. She takes walks with him. She reads poetry. And that night, she takes a fatal dose of poison and kills herself. And so it ends with a letter that she wrote to her friend where she says, "Dearest, I remember how at 18, on hikes with friends, when they rested, and it's all about how she had to hike around them. She couldn't allow herself to rest because she was not yet truly thin." And that resonated with me on such a painful level. The idea that she wasn't who she was meant to be yet, so she couldn't eat, she couldn't participate, she couldn't rest, she couldn't. And I hate to admit it, but that's me in a lot of ways. And that's why I took drugs. That's why I took speed every day to try to live up to some ideal that was basically impossible for me to live up to. I decided it sat inside of me for many years. And one day, like 15 years after I discovered the poem, I wrote to Frank Bedard. I found him on Facebook or whatever, and I asked him if he would give me the rights to the poem. And I told him about Jeffrey, and I told him about my ideas about the poem and why I would want to set it. And he wrote me back a very loving note and said yes. And it was setting that poem to music. I mean, I was in Houston premiering another opera, The House Without a Christmas Tree, which was very different from Ellen West, a family story. And I would wake up at 4:00 and write Ellen West. And it was cathartic, and it also sent me into a deep depression. That's when I got on medication, which has helped. But I went somewhere really far away for writing that piece. And I don't know if you've heard it, but I think it's very beautiful and very haunting. And it also, I had an experience with writing that piece. Frank Bedard is not only an established poet, he's considered one of the greatest living poets. I mean, he won the Pulitzer. And for me to say to him when I was done setting Ellen West to music, Frank, I think what it is what I felt suddenly like I needed a prologue and an epilogue. It was like I had created something. It felt mythological to me. It needed to be introduced and it needed to be finished. And for me to say that to a poet of that stature and say, I need more, and then bicker back and forth with him about what it should be, it was a very big moment for me. It was really big for me to own my own sense of dramaturgy and that I needed something more than what was on the page. And then for me to go through that with him and for him to, and I have that all in the book, all of that stuff about him, right? Arguing with
the dick measuring contest.
Yes, but it was so powerful. It was so powerful. And for me to think that it had to begin with the yoke and Frank saying, no, that isn't who she is. That isn't how this should start. It was, and for us to finally settle on what it was. And one day I'm at jury duty and Frank Bedard calls me on the phone and says, I know what should be the epilogue. And he reads me that incredible poem, Hymn, that ends the opera. And it was like, oh my God, bless you for this. And that is collaboration, you guys.
Yeah.
That's what writing an opera is.
We're running out of time, but I wanted to get your thoughts on one final question, and it relates to Ellen West, since Ellen West as a Beth Morrison commission. Where are we right now in opera history? Since you have done so much in both millenniums, where do you see the audience being and the composer? Now, you're not a monolith, but I personally sense American opera sounding more like Ricky Ian Gordon than it sounded like maybe even in the 80s or 90s, So I don't know if you feel like you're part of this or if you are understanding the trend and who maybe are the composers who are taking that idea and pushing it forward? I don't know. I really, since you're the thick of it, I'd like to know where you think we are.
Well, for that, I will say one thing I will own, you guys, is that the Grapes of Wrath, because of the success of Grapes of Wrath, it did sort of open the door towards a renaissance of American opera, because suddenly every opera company was commissioning a new opera. Because even opera companies realized they could make more of a splash with a new piece. So owning that and feeling good at being at the helm of that, I feel like, and then I feel like the language had to change, because you could no longer, the composers who in the 20th century were scared out of writing in their own voice because they would be so harshly criticized for not being serial or not being aleatoric or not being, that's over. Because if you want an audience, it can't be a steady diet of that kind of music, even though certain critics are still scolding composers for writing how they write. But where I think we are, and it is with people like you mentioned, Jake, I would say, Missy Mazzoli, David T. Little. We have a lot of people that are writing in a really interesting style that also everyone is in their own way an iconoclast. And the only thing I would say is that I'm not sure, is that kind of work going to happen at the Met, or is it going to happen in a black box theater somewhere, or is it going to happen in a swimming pool the way my Orpheus and Eurydice did, or is it going to happen in a closet or in a cemetery? I think as an opera composer now, you have to be open to writing exactly what you want to write and finding where that piece would be most properly represented. And that may not be the Lyric Opera of Chicago or the Met. I was very lucky to do Intimate Apparel at the Lincoln Center Theater. Here was this opera that was 300 people were in the theater hearing those amazing voices, and it was intimate, and you could see every move their face made. And Bart Scher directed it like a theater piece, and I was very proud of it. And I know I was lucky, even, by the way, that they sent a theater reviewer to review it. So what did he say? He called it a knockout. If it was Zach Wolf, he probably would have said it was a turd. You know what I mean? And that's where we are now. Basically, most of the time, critics kill new work, even if when it's all gone, what are they going to write about? But that's where we are. So I have somehow dodged bullets sometimes in a very lucky way. And I hope that for my colleagues. And I do absolutely think the form is alive and thriving, but it is all about composers listening to their own voice, not thinking they have to write grand opera if they don't hear it, okay? And not thinking they have to be at the Met when they don't see their work on that scale. And what you see a lot of times is a piece that doesn't belong at the Met, that should have been intimate and is suddenly blown up out of proportion at the Met.
Yeah.
So for me, the trick of me being Ricky Ian Gordon is me following my own impulses and seeing where it takes me. And that has been useful to me. And if I'm a good example to other composers, it's because I think I followed my own muse, and to thine own self be true.
Such company, as keeps this young nymph for joy. Such company, as keeps this young nymph joy.
Nicole Cabell and Ricky Ian Gordon performing Ricky Ian Gordon's Joy. Our thanks to Macmillan Publishers for putting us in contact with Ricky Ian Gordon. Once again, the name of the book is Seeing Through, a chronicle of sex, drugs, and opera. Weston, I know that you already recorded the front half of this episode, but did you expect the conversation to go in that direction?
I predicted it beat for beat, Oliver.
And we had so many more topics we wanted to get to, but as you can hear, Ricky is you just press the play button and he'll go.
Yeah.
You know?
Well, it's so exciting, like Ricky is very much a consummate artist, and whenever you meet someone who has that sort of connection, you just want to kind of sit back and hear them talk, I think. Thanks once again to Ricky on that incredible conversation from last year. Just a reminder, the world premiere of Ricky Ian Gordon's new opera, This House, is this Saturday at Opera Theater of St. Louis. Make sure you subscribe to our podcast on Spotify. Click follow on Apple Podcasts. Hit the plus sign. If you know someone who's a fan of opera or classical music or even sports, why not drag them on over and tell them about the show? We would love for them to give us their hot takes as well as yours.
Opera class. Sports radio crass. This is Opera Box Score.
We could not have had an episode dedicated to American artists without a great American singer. Oliver spoke to Sylvia McNair in March of 2024. Before we revisit that interview, here is McNair singing Mozart with the Academy of St. Martin in the Fields, led by Neville Mariner.
I want to touch back on something we talked about for my radio show, which is this idea of perfection in singing. And I have to say that, like, listening to your work can be very intimidating, I think, for young singers. And I think a lot of people wanted to imitate your sound, and maybe got themselves into some trouble because of how on recording, especially in your Baroque and Mozart recordings, it sounds like pristine. Like we listened to your Et Incarnatus Est, and we know that thing is just like a vocalese. And your scales and your intonation and the staccati and the ability to turn on the trill, you made it sound so easy. Is there something you'd like to say to those singers who might have heard you and are still influenced by what you did about achieving that level of, note perfect?
Okay, first of all, there's no such thing as perfect. Perfect doesn't exist. When I listen to some of those recordings that you're referencing, I hear so many flaws, Oliver. I hear so many things I wish I'd had a chance to do better. So if perfect doesn't exist, what do we aim for? Excellence. When I can aim for excellence, when I can aim for doing my best on a given day at a given hour when they turn on the microphone, that's really all I've got, because I know it's not going to be perfect. Those would be my comments about striving for perfection. Don't, because it's frustrating. But do strive for your very, very best, your own personal best. Of course, that's a worthwhile endeavor. What was the second thing I was going to say?
I mean, like you were.
Oh! I know what it was. Okay, so okay. Here's something else I'd like to say. That is, don't copy anybody else. If people listen to my recordings and appreciate something about them, I'm really, really honored by that. But the truth of the matter is, every singer needs to be him or herself, to be true to their own sound and not copy someone. I got myself into terrible vocal trouble at one point in my life trying to copy somebody else's sound. It was a teacher, and there were reasons for that choice, but it was not the right choice for me. So finding your own voice, and frankly, finding coaches and teachers who will help you find your own voice rather than trying to get you to replicate someone else's sound. That's what you need to be doing.
Now that you've retired from teaching, do you look back at your teaching career fondly? And do you have, did you have students who came to you like I'm coming to today, like just, drop down at your feet like you're my queen, like, please teach me everything you know?
I had some students in my 10 years of teaching on the faculty at the Jacobs School of Music at Indiana University who will be my friends for life. I've even put a lot of them in my will. That's true, because we have developed relationships, friendships beyond teacher-student relationships since I retired from the faculty. And I am in contact with at least a dozen of them, certainly monthly, sometimes weekly. Working with young singers was far and away the best part of 10 years on a faculty. I was on a wonderful faculty at a school that is very big, very well known for its size, and certainly a lot of activities going on. I came to academia sort of after 25 years, a quarter of a century in the real world, as we call it, capital T, capital R, capital W. And it was a difficult transition for me to suddenly have to figure out how to navigate academia. I'm not sure I did that part very successfully, but when it comes to the students, that was my great joy. I taught some classes. I actually taught a class called English Diction for Singers, where I taught the International Phonetic Alphabet. That meant I had to learn the International Phonetic Alphabet. Well, I'd been working with the IPA for many, many years, but I really had to learn it in a way that I was worthy of teaching it. So that was a great experience, and I loved those hours with the young singers in the English Diction for Singers class. Absolutely loved that. I also taught an opera workshop in which we did a lot of musical theater, and I renamed the class Performance Workshop because I wanted students to get better at more things. In this day and age, if you're going to be employed as a singer, you got to be able to do it all, not just, focus in on one aspect of singing, not just focusing on classical music. It's still what a lot of people teach, but I actually think the more things you can do and do well, the better your chances are of being gainfully employed.
I'm so glad to hear that you have that philosophy. I don't want to lose sight of the fact that your musicianship is very high. Your musical skill is at a very high level, and we know that's because you started as an instrumentalist. But listening to your recordings of 17th and 18th century music, before there was this explosion of, quote unquote opera singers, breaking into the period instrument movement, you were doing it. And you're somebody who is like on the forefront of this movement. And now it seems like everybody has to do their Handel album, has to do their Seicento album. And what was it like to be an American in, the 90s who was getting a lot of work in this movement when it was mostly Europeans that were doing it?
I didn't really have to actively break into anything, Oliver. I really just walked through the doors that opened for me. My voice is not a great, big, huge operatic voice by American standards. I don't sing, Verdi and Puccini and Wagner and all that big rep. My voice was much better suited to 17th and 18th century music. And honestly, the European piece of my career was far and away the larger. I was in Europe 6 to 9 months of every year for many, many years, 12 to 15 years, I'd say, because that was where I fit. I had a great manager there who, made things happen. I'm not sure that kind of management exists anymore, but in the late 80s and 90s and the early O's, that's where the work was for me, the work that fit me and the work that I fit. So that's where I spent my time singing, but I don't really feel like I was breaking any boundaries. I was just working a lot with John Eliot Gardner and Chris Hogwood, and those people were the leaders, the true leaders in this so-called early music movement, the original instruments period. Chris has passed away, but John Eliot Gardner is still going strong.
There is the American approach to teaching singing, which tends to make everything international, where, we're basically, it's the foundation is the bel canto technique. And if you're, quote unquote, like a good singer, like you have height and all the vowels, the tone is even top to bottom, you can have a healthy projection, and you sacrifice, style. You sacrifice specific vowels for different languages. You don't sing off the breath ever. Maybe your phrasing is a little bit more generic as opposed to looking for those shorter phrases with more gestural phrases. And so when I listen to your 17th and 18th century music, it's like you have a very healthy sound, but yet you're going for these, things that signal to people who are like nerdy about this music, oh, she's doing all of that too, and she's singing healthy. Does that make sense now, what I'm saying?
Well, you're smarter than I am. Because I certainly followed everything you said, but I'm absolutely certain I was not thinking all of that while I was doing it. I will say this, going back to having been trained as a violinist all those years and years and years, 17th and 18th century music, for the most part, if you put your thumb over the words, the melody you're looking at is an instrumental melody. It's the same as the oboe player or the flute player has, or the violin player has, or the cello player has. It's an instrumental line, but then with words underneath. So I have always assumed that my success, such as it was in 17th and 18th century rep, had as much to do with approaching it as a violinist. And then, oh yeah, putting the words in too. So words have always mattered so much to me. And I'll tell you a story, speaking of Handel, I'll tell you a story that goes right along with that. When I was doing the role of Cleopatra in Handel's opera, Julius Caesar, I was more interested in Cleopatra, the historical person, and I wanted to know more about her story and her life than the role in the Handel opera gave me the opportunity to run with. Handel opera, like bel canto opera, is all about showing off the voice. That's what makes it work or not. How well can you show off all the things your voice can do? How fast are your melismas? How fancy are your ornaments? How masterful are your trills? How great is your pitch? How soft is your soft? How loud is your loud? All those vocal gymnastics, the Olympics for the voice, I sometimes call it. How well can you show off all of those things? Well, okay, fine, but it doesn't really give you a chance to delve into a story or a character quite as much as I was always interested in doing. So I'm glad that you think I have great musicianship and intonation and agility. I'm really glad you feel that way. Intonation has always been, a very high priority for me, and that definitely has its roots in playing the violin.
Your interest in language, I think, comes across very well in the back half of your career, especially the recordings you made with Andre Previn and David Fink. But you did record this album of Mélodie with Roger Vignol that I love so much. And we're going to finish today listening to Spleen, which is not really like a show closer per se, but I just want the audience to hear just like the spectrum of what you just said. Like, this song is very quiet. It's very intimate. But then there's like this gut punch line at the end. And you pull the trigger. And in your, classical era recordings, we don't often hear you go for that tone quality, like something that feels very, for lack of a better word, full-throated and hurt. And I remember hearing this for the first time. I was like, oh my gosh, I didn't know she could make a sound like that. Do you remember that song Spleen from Ariette Ubilé? I know it's been a while since you probably sang that.
You think?
Yeah.
Now you have me curious. I'm going to have to go get that disc out of a box, which is buried in a corner of a closet.
It's probably on your computer somewhere. Just go to Spotify.
Put it on the CD player and try to figure out what you're talking about. I will say, again, singing these chansons, they were the natural stepping stone to move into doing cabaret, because French songs are salon songs. They're very intimate. They're very, as John Corigliano used to say to me about my microphone technique, Sylvia, you have a for your ears only kind of sound on the mic. Well, I take that as a great compliment because, again, the microphone increased my choices for expression. Now, that the microphone came into play in the songbook, in the American songbook rep, not in the French rep. In the French repertoire, you're singing acoustically, you're singing naturally, but very much pulled back. You cannot sing song rep, whether it's lieder or chanson or Spanish songs or songs in English, classical songs in English. You cannot sing them like they're opera arias. You have to pull it in and make it a much more for your ears only kind of sound.
Well, I've kept you for long enough. Sylvia McNair, thank you for joining us on Opera Box Score.
It has been my extreme pleasure, Oliver. Thank you. Thank you, thank you, thank you.
Another recording of hers that I've always loved is the complete recording of the Britten Midsummer Night's Dream that she made with the London Symphony Orchestra in 1996. I know Brian Asawa is the Oberon on that. Yeah. But just like the clarity of her tone and the just like transparency with which she's able to sing really, really works in new music as well. I mean, that's not like, that wasn't like brand new music in the 90s, but there's some weird moments in that Midsummer Night's Dream, and especially for Titania, where they just have to, she is totally able to float all those gossamer lines and just sound completely otherworldly, which is both sonically beautiful and also like very much the character of the opera.
Well, we spent a lot of time on WFMT talking about her And True Love, which she recorded under Seiji Ozawa with Anthony Rolfe Johnson as Tom Rakewell and Jane Henschel as Baba the Turk. But in between the interview, you heard selections from that recording of Popea made with the English Baroque soloists, and let's just call them JEG. You also heard a little bit of Da Tempeste from her Metropolitan Opera performance of Giulio Cesare, conducted by John Nelson. And that last clip, as I had set up in the interview, from her album of French Mélodie, the song Spleen by Debussy with pianist Roger Vignoles.
And thank you once again to Sylvia McNair. Help us spread the word about Opera Box Score by giving us a rating on Apple Podcast or Spotify. And if you have a few extra moments, why not write a review? You know, usually this is the time to go to 2-minute drill, but you know, if you plug your ears and close your eyes, it's like there's no news at all. Good call, bad call. Let's wrap this show up.
Good call, bad call on Opera Box Score.
Good call, bad call. That's how we end the show, even when I'm the only person in the room. We have a little note from Oliver Camacho. He says, good call to Elsa van den Heever, who was perfectly demented as Salome, as seen in the new Klaus Gut production at the Met over the weekend. Oliver says the entire cast was solid, especially friend of the show Michel de Jong as Herodias and Peter Mattei as John the Baptist. His only complaint is that he thinks children, even Manhattan-raised children who take dance lessons and whose parents put them up for audition for this very production, should not be subjected to acts of necrophilia, fair, or that famously dissonant, most sickening chord in all of opera after Salome kisses Johannan's severed head. But you know, Oliver, that chord is why I'm the way I am. Oh, wait, that's not a good thing. I have a good call. Coming up this Saturday at the Chicago Symphony Orchestra. That's the 31st. If you're in town, I will be giving the pre-show talk for an evening of American and American-adjacent music, including Dvorak. Janai Brugger will be there singing songs of Florence Price and Porgy and Bess. So why not stop by, see the show, and if you come a little bit early, you can heckle me and throw rotten vegetables. That is it for this week's edition of America's Talk Radio Show about opera. Make sure you subscribe to the show wherever you get your podcasts, get your voice heard, and find links to stuff we've talked about at our website, operaboxscore.com. That's also where you can put your money where our mouths are. Give back to the OBS using the Support the Team tab. Your announcer is Norm Waddell. Your creative consultant is Oliver Camacho, and your audio editor is me. The executive producer of the OBS is George Cedarquist. For all of us at OBS and our guests Ricky Ian Gordon and Sylvia McNair, I'm Weston Williams, asking you to continue the conversation about opera as you aim for excellence rather than perfection. We're back with an all-new show next week when we go Inside the Huddle with tenor Josh Lovell, starring as Jupiter in Atlanta Opera's Semele. Plus, you get more opera headlines, more hot takes, and more shocking chords/autobiographies. Join us.